Welcome to Season 3 of the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. Last year, host Jorden Guth got a crash course in the fundamentals of hi-fi from enthusiasts, journalists, manufacturers, and music industry professionals alike. Those lessons will continue, but this year, Jorden will also get a history lesson from the legends who were there from the giddy-up and who made hi-fi what it is today. So with that out of the way, here's Jorden and this week's guest.
Hello and welcome to the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. Today we're back with Dr. Floyd Toole. In our last episode, we spoke to Dr. Toole about his start in music and audio all the way through to just before starting the Athena project at the National Research Council in Canada. And we're going to pick up this episode. We are going to get to the Athena project, but there was something that we talked about on the break that we really want to kind of set the stage for the Athena project. And part of that is in the testing schema that Dr. Floyd and his team kind of developed. So welcome back, Dr. Floyd.
Thank you, Jorden.
Can you talk to us about the testing schema that you kind of developed leading up to the Athena project and why that was so important and instrumental?
Okay, well, it's a very interesting story, and it has some twists and turns, and some of them were related to just chance factors, as I've said earlier in the first episode, that chance has played a role in my life, and in this case, here's another example of it. When I set up the very first Friday afternoon listening test that started all of this loudspeaker investigation, I was basically looking for an efficient way to compare a bunch of loudspeakers. And so I just set up 4 loudspeakers behind a curtain and switched among them. I made them equally loud and switched one to the other in a random fashion, and people listened and formed opinions. And it happened very easily. I didn't think a lot about it at the time, but later on, I reflected on it and I said, now that was a very fortuitous experimental design, because what I was doing was allowing the people to hear within a very short time span the different colorations that were added by 4 different loudspeakers to the program, which was constant. The music wasn't changing. The room wasn't changing. What was changing was the loudspeaker. You were switching from one loudspeaker to another. So what you were hearing was, in fact, the timbral change that was being imposed by the different loudspeakers and how they performed. It was very straightforward and very easy, and I just took it for granted. However, later on, I began to think, well, there are statistical methods for doing these kinds of tests, and the traditional one is A versus B. Product A, product B, you compare A and B, and you hear the difference between A and B. That's true. But what you don't hear so easily is what's the same between A and B. So if A and B share a problem, you might not notice it. And to put a finer point on this, I've seen examples of this in companies that start with a prototype and then develop a succeeding product on that same prototype. They improve upon it and improve upon that. And they keep going back using A-B comparisons to something that preceded the current developed product. And so you find that eventually they have just perpetuated the problem, one of the problems that was already there all along. We just didn't hear it until one day they put in brand C, and oh my goodness, we have a problem.
There's the issue.
Yeah. There's the issue. So A-B comparisons are fine, but you have to take A and B from a population of loudspeakers. You might have 5 or 6 loudspeakers, and you compare them in A-B fashion in random order, which you can do, and that's fine. That's a perfectly legitimate way of doing it. However, it's extremely inefficient. It takes a lot of time, a lot of preparation, a lot of work. And the A, B, C, D, the 3 or 4 at a time, is much more efficient, and as it turns out, avoids some of these practical issues. The ABX technique, that the ABX box, I'm sure you've all heard of, is there to show up a difference. Do you hear any difference between A and B, no matter how small? It's not there to help you scale a difference that you hear. As in loudspeakers, there's no problem hearing a difference between product A and product B loudspeakers, as there is in amplifiers or wire or whatever else you may choose to compare. Anyway, so that's where it all began. So we started off by good chance having a very efficient and effective experimental method, which I applied over the next several years and learned more about what was happening and developed measurements that were better at revealing performance aspects of the loudspeakers, particularly on-axis and various off-axis measurements, which not everybody back then was doing. So I would always show a family of curves on in 30, 15, 30, 45, and 60 degrees off-axis at the very least. And when you look at these families of curves, you can see patterns, and patterns tell you something about what's going on. And when, at a certain point, I had enough information to start trying to do statistical analysis, I went to a University of Ottawa statistician, person of some note in the field, and asked him for some help. And he said, if you're looking for trends, which is what I was looking for, what are the factors at play in all of these listening tests? He said, the simplest thing to do is just put your data, your scatter plots, up on a wall, stand back and look at them. And so he said, back then, we said we may or may not have a statistical model that would show what the eyes and the brain actually can see. So nowadays, the statistical models have gone really quite advanced, and nobody in my right mind would do what I did back then. But you can still do it because it still works. As a matter of fact, it doesn't give you a measure of statistical significance. Anyway, that's all an aside. The result was that all of the loudspeakers that people gave the highest ratings to had smooth and flat on-axis frequency responses. The first sound arriving at their ears, the direct sound, was as neutral as what we could measure at the time.
So I do have one question about this measurement, because, and this, correct me here, this was still in the early to the mid, almost late 80s that you were kind of fine tuning this testing.
Well, what I'm talking about now is the data that led up to my papers in 1985 and 86.
Okay, so a little bit before then.
It's early 80s, yeah. So this is all done in the early 80s.
And when you're testing these speakers, when you're playing them, are you doing this in mono or stereo?
We did the mono test because it was very simple. That's all. Laziness, if you like. But when we did, and when I did do stereo tests, which I did, of course, to reveal the sound stage and imaging and all those good factors that come to life with the second channel being added, then it turns out that the flaws in the loudspeaker that were evident in the mono tests were not so obvious. And so that raised the question, well, what's going on here? And I'm getting ahead of the story here, so you can remind me about this a little later.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Days, okay. So moving on from the pattern of smooth on-axis direct sound, so the neutral direct sound, as it seems to be important, that's what listeners are telling us anyway. Then what about the off-axis responses? And if you look at these families of curves, if there was a bump in the on-axis curve and it shows up in the off-axis curves as well, then that's very likely to be a resonance, not an acoustical interference. The acoustical interference, one sound interfering constructively and destructively with a later arriving sound, that generates a particular pattern that you can see in the curves. However, that pattern changes with microphone position. A resonance pattern does not change with microphone position. It radiates equally in all directions. And so when you look on and off axis in these families of curves and you see a little bump that shows up in all of the curves, the chances are almost inescapable that this is going to be a resonance. And if it's a resonance, you can inescapably say that it's going to change the timbre of the sound, not in a way that is desirable, because resonances are the building blocks of all the sound, music, vocal sounds that we care to listen to. So we don't want them messed with, basically. We don't want any added resonances from the loudspeakers. So basically, we learned really quite early on that resonances were perhaps one of the major problems that show up in loudspeakers because they modify timbre, and that's what we are judging when we judge sound quality. So on and off axis curves were very useful in revealing resonances and also useful in revealing the uniformity of the sound that is being radiated from the loudspeaker in all different directions. So ideally, from a naive perspective, you can say, well, we want the direct sound, first arriving sound, and all reflected sounds coming from room, floor, ceiling, and walls to have the same basic timbral signature. And that can only happen if the off-axis responses are smooth and relatively flat. So it turns out that the loudspeakers that win the listening tests or had the highest ratings all had smooth and flat on-axis response, but those that had smooth and flat-ish off-axis response did even better.
Oh.
Okay? So now we're beginning to see patterns that could be useful in setting targets for designing loudspeakers that sound good, basically. And so these were early days. So that was useful. One of the things that I did that was quite remarkable to me was I said, well, this is fine. We're looking at what's leaving the loudspeaker. I wonder what's arriving at the listening position. So we had our own listening room, and I measured it, did some calculations. And I set up a set of data which had the direct sound, the on-axis sound. You aim the loudspeaker at the listener, so the on-axis sound is the direct sound. And you measure, say, 50 degrees down for the floor bounce and 40 degrees up for the ceiling bounce and 30 or 40 degrees left for one sidewall bounce and 70 or 80 degrees off-axis the other direction for the other sidewall bounce. And you can say, well, these are the dominant early reflections. There are only 4 of them. Why 4? Because the floor and the ceiling and the sidewall are all that rectangular in a rectangular cube.
Yeah.
Walls are always vertical. Floor and ceiling are always horizontal. And those will be the strongest first reflections that will arrive at the listening position. There will be others later on, but the others that come later on will go off at different angles and be reflected through several surfaces before they finally get to the ear, and therefore will be much attenuated and much energy lost at every reflection point. So it's just being naive about it. I thought, well, let's just start with the direct sound, the first reflections. And while we're at it, let's just do sound power, because that's a total sound radiated from the loudspeaker, which probably is going to be useful at low frequencies because at low frequencies the wavelengths are long, so it's all going to add up. So I did this little exercise and calculated quite exactly, I could, first approximations at least, what the first sound would be like at the listening position. Not what leaves the loudspeaker, but what level would it be at the listening position? And then did the same for the early reflected sounds, and did the same for the sound power, and superimpose those 3 curves. And you say, my goodness, this is interesting, because at low frequencies, the sound power is what's dictating what we are hearing. But above 5 or so kilohertz, 3, 4, 5 kilohertz, depends on the directivity of the loudspeaker. It's the direct sound that is dominant. But in between, through all this very important middle frequency range, you have to measure everything, because everything is contributing to what we hear. That's interesting. So they're learning stuff now. And then, so I said, this was all now I had created, by this stage, I had created a digital data acquisition system so I could manipulate these curves a bit. And so I added them up in terms of energy. I added all the direct sound, the early reflected sounds, and the sound power. I added the energies of all of those curves, and what could be a prediction of a room curve. And so we now have, I did a comparison between the measured acoustical measured of the room curve and my prediction of the room curve. And above 300 or 400 hertz, they laid on top of each other.
Interesting.
So, this is amazing. I mean, this is before 1985. So this is not new magic stuff, but most people still don't know
it.
Yeah. Most people don't read.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there you go. So this is the basis of what eventually ended up as the spinorama, which is now an industry standard method of presenting loudspeaker data. So we're not presenting data on the sound that is leaving the loudspeaker. We are presenting data on the sound that might arrive at a listener's ears, because that's what matters.
So with that, you now have kind of a testing philosophy that gets you results that you're interested in using and can kind of help people develop new loudspeakers, new technology. That is an extra piece to the puzzle. You also have a group of folks, and you have the kind of incentive that the NRC money, the kind of research money, is drying up, so it's not as readily available. Is this how the Athena project kind of starts coming together? All the different pieces just kind of aligning?
Well, you've described the financial component of it. There's no doubt about that. We needed more money to pursue the research that we saw as being necessary. And where I left off my story was that I had been able to predict a room curve from a set of anechoic data, except that below 300 or 400 hertz, the room itself is in control.
Oh.
The bass resonances in the room become the dominant factor. And for every loudspeaker location and every listener location, there will be a different transfer function.
Oh.
No two seats in a room share the same bass sound.
Below 300 hertz.
No, yeah, below the transition frequency. And so if you're going to ask a question that really severely needs answers, that's one. Added to the importance of it was one of the observations from my early crude statistical analysis was that there was a correlation between bass extension and listener preference. So the lower in bass a loudspeaker went, the higher light was the preference, other factors being relatively equal. So bass is important. I'll jump way ahead now and say that when Sean Olive joined me at Harman, and we were challenged with finding a better correlation between what we measure and what we hear, he found that bass response accounts for approximately 30% of an overall sound quality rating.
Huh.
And if bass performance is dictated by your listening room and how you set it up, its shape and how you set it up, then we have a problem that designing a loudspeaker doesn't itself solve. Passive loudspeakers can't solve room problems. You have to do something else. And the first level of approaching this was to involve electronics and equalization. And this was the subject of the Athena project.
Oh, that's awesome.
We can't solve this problem with the passive loudspeaker design, so let's make it into an active loudspeaker or an outboard apparatus that can modify the performance of the passive loudspeaker.
So, and with that, as you're leaning up to the Athena project, you already mentioned Sean Olive. There was other people that were instrumental in kind of bringing this all together. You mentioned electronics. Was that Peter Shook?
Peter Shook was definitely a major factor in the electronics design. Mark Bonneville, another one.
Yeah.
And the two of them, one did the hardware basically, and one did the software design, the mathematical portion of it. And the team was excellent. I mean, they really were powerful.
Did you already have these folks? Were they already kind of working for you consistently at that point? Or did you have to effectively assemble them into this Athena project and say, like, this is the money, these are the people I want to work with, and pull together and kind of make this happen?
Well, details that you're asking for, I frankly don't all remember. Peter Shook was in situ, and he just kind of joined the team and was a very logical and good member of it.
Yeah.
Mark Bonneville was hired, and he was a circuit designer. And Sean was already there, and we hired a couple of other people to become gophers essentially, and provide assistance, because there was an awful lot of needing done, and hands were helpful. There's no doubt about that. The project was and we built a suite of 4 rooms that were at adjustable walls. And so if we're going to examine the behavior of loudspeakers in rooms, we need to have many rooms, and we need to have ready access to them over long periods of time. So we just built a suite of rooms in our laboratory that could be modified in shape and size. And they were just about to do that particular test when my phone rang, and I was invited to move to Harman, and I took that opportunity. Sorry about that, but there you go.
Yeah.
But they finished the experiment and wrote it up, and it is a benchmark experiment, because what it showed was that they compared 3 closely rated, good-sounding loudspeakers. So it was not an easy test. They compared 3 loudspeakers in 4 very different rooms. One of them L-shaped even. There was serious contrasts in the room size and the room proportions and shapes. Yet, at the end of the exercise, people who sat in those rooms comparing the loudspeakers ended up rating them very similarly.
Across the different rooms.
Across the different rooms. So the room,
fascinating.
It was fascinating indeed. And the next part of it is even perhaps more fascinating, because they had done a very smart thing, and that is to do binaural recordings of everything that the listeners heard in those tests, and took those same binaural recordings. And by the way, when they did the tests with the binaural recordings and compared the results of those tests with the results of sitting in a room live, listening to the real loudspeakers, the results were essentially the same. So the binaural recording system really does work extremely well. Then they changed the experiment. They compared loudspeaker A in room 2 with loudspeaker C in room 3, and mixed up the loudspeaker in the room combinations, so that what you would hear one loudspeaker in one room compared to a different loudspeaker in a different room. And in that case, the room became the dominant factor, whereas in the previous case, the loudspeaker was the dominant factor, and the room was not a statistically significant variable. When you're sitting in a room, you adapt to that room. The pattern of reflections in that room are imprinted in your mind as, this is the reference, this is where I am, and now I'm listening to a sound in this room, and I'm listening to a different sound in this room, and then I'm listening to a different sound in this room. So I'm now able to compare the sounds one to the other. However, if you switch rooms at the same time as you switch the sounds with the loudspeakers, then the room becomes the dominant factor. It's a fascinating exercise, because it shows you that, well, and there are a number of scientific studies that confirm this. You walk into a room, and literally within a few seconds, you apprehend enough about the acoustics of that room that speech intelligibility is significantly improved. So we learn about rooms. I mean, the example I give often is, if you're walking down the street with one of your buddies and you're talking, and your buddy's voice is 10 out of 10 on the fidelity scale. He's the real person talking to you. And you walk from the outdoors where there's no reflections except the ground. You walk into the entrance foyer of a large building, and it's very reverberant. And yet your buddy's voice is still your buddy's voice, but it's in this reverberant space. And you walk down the long corridor. Now, corridors have very distinctive resonant sounds, but it's still your buddy's voice. And you go into the men's room, and the men's room, they're very reverberant, very reflective. And so it's still your buddy's voice. And then you walk into an open plan office, and it's kind of a muted kind of background acoustic. And it's still your buddy's voice. So we are adapting on the fly to the acoustic space within which we hear simple sounds, like voice, like like a single musical instrument, that kind of thing. And so here we are doing loudspeaker tests and finding out, lo and behold, the same thing applies. When we sit in a room, we normalize, not completely. I mean, there can be room problems in the room that you just can't, they're so severe you can't normalize them. But within the reasonable range of normalcy, we adapt sufficiently to the room we are in that we can listen to quite small details of sound quality differences in the source of the sound.
That is absolutely fascinating. Now, to your point, and I think you mentioned this earlier, the idea that that makes it potentially harder to design a loudspeaker if you know how much the room is going to influence the sound for better or for worse.
Well, that's right. And the part of the frequency range over which it has its dominant influence, which is the bass, is like 30% of the importance of sound quality, of ratings of sound quality. So you ignore the bass at your peril. I mean, it's a big factor. It's a big part of what we listen to. So what do we do about it? Well, this was the topic of the Athena project. We believed that the room resonances themselves behave somewhat like, turns out they behave a lot like minimum phase phenomena, which means that what you see in the amplitude frequency versus frequency response from that you can predict the time domain. So if you see a peak in the frequency response, there will be ringing in the time domain. So it's a resonance if you see a peak. And if it's a narrow peak, it will be a high Q resonance and it will ring a long time. If it's a broader peak, it'll be a lower Q resonance. It will ring a shorter time. If it's a very wide peak, a bump, it'll be a low Q resonance and it'll hardly ring at all. So the time domain and the frequency domain are related directly in a minimum phase system. And loudspeaker transducers are all minimum phase, which means that a loudspeaker that has electronics attached to it, where you can do digital equalization, is that it can be a much better loudspeaker than just a passive loudspeaker, because you can fix things electronically. You can electronically remove a bump in the frequency response curve and fix the time domain. Literally.
So, and you also mentioned that essentially you did not complete the Athena project at the NRC. You essentially...
No, I bailed out.
You bailed out. You got everything going. You assembled the team, and then you're like, yeah, you guys got this. I'm going from there.
Yeah.
Actually, maybe this is a good time to kind of just interject a quick little break for the audience. And then when we get back, maybe we can pick up of kind of how and why you left the Athena project when you did, and where that kind of brings us from there.
Okay. Sounds good.
And welcome back from our quick break. Where we left off, we were going to go into talking about your time and your move to California, your time with Harman. However, was there anything else that you kind of wanted to touch on, or was there any important bits that we missed leading up to that you wanted to cover?
Yeah, there is. It was an interesting development that came out of some work we did with the CBC. CBC Engineering Department approached us for assistance in selecting monitor loudspeakers for use throughout the nationwide network. They wanted big loudspeakers for big studios, control rooms, medium-sized ones for smaller venues, and small ones for portable use. And they wanted them all to be good, of course, and they wanted them all to be timbrally similar so that work could translate from one size studio to another one without too much contrast. And I thought, well, this is also great because I was still looking for grist for my mill is loudspeakers to test and listeners to come and evaluate them. So this was a perfect match for me. They provided some 30 loudspeakers candidates that they had found in the marketplace that could be conceivably used in their studios. And they would provide listeners. I thought to myself, well, I'm just going to sneak a few extra products in, some consumer products that we've been working with, and some of our listeners, because let's expand the horizons of this evaluation process a bit. And the CBC went along with it fine. I mean, they thought this was all just wonderful. And at some considerable expense, they flew people from all across Canada and put them up for several days while they participated in listening tests. And these were recording engineers and producers and, people of significant experience and seniority in some cases in their organization. We started off by measuring all the candidates, the loudspeaker candidates, and some of them were just plain dreadful. So we just abandoned those with mutual agreement. It's just, no, that's not worth wasting time on. So that's weaned out the worst ones. And we ended up with, I can't remember now, something like 15 to 20 candidates of different sizes that could be conceivably useful for their purposes. And we set up a regime of double-blind listening tests, all randomized and presented in an organized, systematic fashion. And we had the technical data done. We measured the chambers, and so we were all set to go. Started the listening tests, and everything was fine, except that, again, you stand back and look at data. It's interesting. You see patterns, and so some people were just very inconsistent in their judgments. Because I was used to people, our listeners. You find the odd person who couldn't form an opinion consistently or had trouble. And in many cases, we never tracked down what the cause was. We just said, well, he or she was not a good listener. But in this case, we had to think that these were all experienced people. So they're all, in quotes, good listeners, but some of them can't seem to form consistent opinions. They give a loudspeaker a high rating in the morning and come back after lunch and listen to the same loudspeaker, same music, just in a different sequence, and give it a very different rating. What's going on here? Fortunately, this is another chance factor. We had measured the audiograms of all of our listeners. Oh. Because I was beginning to think, your ears are broken. You're not necessarily going to be a good listener. But let's just find out. Well, it turned out that a lot of these some of these recording engineers had really dreadful hearing. And sound recording, professional audio, in professional audio in general, hearing loss is an occupational hazard.
For sure.
These people are exposed to loud sound. And to make it worse, some of them play in bands on the weekends or in the evenings and expose themselves to even more loud sound, and maybe drive a Harley Davidson and expose them or shoot guns, and who knows? I mean, you have vocational and avocational exposures to loud sound, and it all adds up. In one case, this poor man, his little daughter, 3-year-old daughter, came up to him while he was reading a newspaper and done the falsetto scream in his ear, "Hey, Daddy!" And he lost significant hearing in that ear.
No way.
That one little innocent experience. Anyway, long story short, it turns out that hearing loss correlated with variations in judgments. And it was an inescapable conclusion. It was very, very clear. And so from that point on, I have to say, we don't bother with people who have hearing loss. Their opinions, they form opinions very well. They have opinions, but their opinions are their own, not to be shared. And that's just a fact of life. Anyway, in my case, I have to say also that when I reached about in my early 60s, I was at Harman. I was still occasionally a participant in listening tests because I enjoyed it. It's a little exercise. And I used to be very good at it. But I could tell I was having a little more difficulty forming opinions. Maybe the loudspeakers are getting better. That could be a problem, factor. But no, I just felt I was not as adept at it as I used to be, and it showed up in my statistics. My variations in judgments were going up, and so I was retired from the listening panel. And my opinions are my own, and that's that. So, not to be shared. I wonder how many loudspeaker reviewers find themselves in that situation. Calf, wheeze.
Yeah. So it's interesting you say that about the reviewers, because that is something that I've spoken to a couple different people about, where there's no standard by which you say, all right, you're going to be an audio reviewer. You should probably do your listening tests and maybe publish the listening tests as part of your review, because that would be very open and honest.
Wouldn't hurt.
I haven't seen anything like that. And it is a good point where there is an opinion, people share it, especially with YouTube now. Everyone has an opinion. But whether or not it's based in factual, documented, scientific information is another thing.
Yeah, well, there are the two factors when people form and express opinions is what are the listening circumstances under which they form the opinions. If they're just listening to a single loudspeaker, I'm afraid that's not a very good opinion. Not a very useful opinion, even if their hearing is normal, because we adapt to it. If they're doing comparative listening, then A, B is better than nothing, and A, B, C, D is terrific. That's wonderful. But then on top of that, is their hearing adequate to the task? And we in Harman and others in the different parts of the world have explored this now, and it's pretty much agreed upon that your hearing thresholds ought to be within perhaps 15 to 20 dB of normal over the frequency range in order for you to qualify as being a reasonably reliable listener, in the sense that your opinions could be translatable to be useful to the public at large. Now, what percentage of the public at large has normal hearing in that range? Roughly about 75%. So, this is not an exclusive club by any means. Although I must say, there's evidence now recently that people who are listening with these earbuds are rapidly losing hearing, younger generation. So that statistic might not be useful anymore, frankly. But it's a different situation now.
That is fascinating. And we kind of went off on a little bit of an aside, and I think we could still kind of explore some of that stuff. Let's bring it back just a moment to kind of your decision to leave the NRC and make your way to Harman.
Okay.
And can you share a little bit about that experience? Like, how did this all come about, and why was it the right time to kind of make that jump to a private industry as opposed to government?
One day, the phone rang, and it was a headhunter who described a job, and he said, would I possibly be interested in this job? And the job was corporate vice president of engineering for a very large audio company, unnamed. I asked a few questions and concluded that possibly was or probably was Harman or JBL, that kind of that. He didn't deny it. And I said, basically, I'm comfortably employed. I'm not looking for a job, but give me your number, and if I think of anybody who might be useful, I'll call you back. And, I put the phone down, and basically my life flashed before me in the proverbial way. And it was a feeling rather than a logical sequence of anything. It was just a feeling that I had done most of the research that I needed to do. The project was kind of wrapping up a loose end, and it was being wrapped up. And I was 54 years old, and this sounded like an interesting opportunity. So I swear it was within a minute or so I called him back. And I said, this was on a Thursday, and I said, I'm starting on Saturday. I'm going to be touring a number of Audio Engineering Society chapters, starting in Toronto and going across to Vancouver and then down to Portland and Seattle, San Francisco, and then off to a little holiday. And I said, maybe we could meet on the way somewhere. And so we met at San Francisco after I had given a lecture the night before at the Dolby Theatre. And my wife and I were there together and with him, and we met for breakfast, and conversation went on right through to dinner time. He had done his homework. He really knew Harman inside out and was very candid about what he felt the situation was. I was if I took this job or was accepted for this job, I'd be the fourth corporate vice president of engineering in as many years. They had hired and fired 3 of the former. So I'd be walking into a revolving door. The difference was that, as he says, this is the first time they hired a headhunter to find a candidate. They previously had just relied on recommendations from buddies in the industry. And so he, as I say, he had done his homework about Harman and me. I think he knew everything about me except my shoe size. and he said, I think you're the solution. And I said, well, gosh, sounds interesting, but from what I know of LA, it's not a place to live. It's just a place to go and do things, but not to live. No. He says, civilized life is possible. Give it a chance. Go down and spend some time, explore, perhaps. And so my wife and I thought about it and said, we abandoned our vacation thoughts and flew down to LA and just hung out. We went into, booked around the houses and thought, well, could be a Ford and all of that, and drove around the area. And decided that, some parts of it are pretty darn nice. And
LA is pretty beautiful.
It is. It's a lovely part of the world.
Yeah.
And so we took it to the next step. I made the contact with Harman and we had a chat, very informal. They didn't quite know how to interview me, frankly, because they thought I was an academic and, it's kind of professorial type academic. And that's not me. I'm an engineer and I had been working with industry intimately. So I was very close to the product design process, at least, if not the product manufacturing process. But none of that was foreign to me. And, they said, well, what do you suggest? How do we know? How can we evaluate your competence and whether you're going to be a match for our needs? And so I said, well, I've been on a speaking tour and I've got this stack of 2 inches of overhead transparencies. This was before PowerPoint. And so I said, I can give an extensive lecture displaying all my knowledge and ignorance to your engineers if you want to let the engineers choose their next corporate representative. And so it was arranged. I spoke for 4 hours.
Whoa.
Starting at 8:00 in the morning, ended at noon. And to all of the engineers that they could assemble, some from Japan and some from Europe, and most of them were local in California, fortunately. And the corporate management was there, and Sidney Harman was there. And Sidney, God bless him, stayed the whole 4 hours.
No way.
Now, none of it was an anecdote. About 6 months, or within 6 months at least, a few months before this event, John Ergel, whom I had known for years, John Ergel is a famous man in the industry and recording engineer, loudspeaker engineer, written books on microphones and everything. And we had got to know each other a little bit, meeting at Audio Engineering Society events, and he learned about my work and said, "Can I come and visit?" So he made a point of coming to Ottawa, and I toured him around and let him experience our process and so on. He was very impressed, and he said, we cannot measure our loudspeakers. If I send you some of our products, will you measure them for us? And I said, sure. Again, more grist for my mill, more products.
Yeah.
So I got about a dozen or so different products, some large professional ones and some, all sizes, down to a couple of consumer products. And so I measured them and sent him the data, and he was intrigued, absolutely intrigued. And I had this data. So at the end of my 4-hour lecture, at about the 3-hour and 45-minute point, everybody in the room could look at a set of loudspeaker measurements and make an opinion about what it might possibly sound like, good, bad, or indifferent. Because I taught them over the previous 4 hours, 3.5 hours. And so I showed them all these. I said, here are some Harman products. You make your own minds up. And they were all over the map. I mean, there was no hint of a corporate target.
Oh, wow.
And so I was hired.
That's awesome. And this is why you need me right here.
I guess, yes. It was rather pointed, I must say. Yeah. So
that's
anyway,
amazing.
I was hired. And so I get there, and as a corporate officer, none of the loudspeaker engineers were actually under my employment. I mean, I had no line authority to any of the engineers. I was a corporate entity aside, and I could exercise intellectual influence, but that's about all. And so that was kind of a challenge. I hadn't thought about that part of it, because there were some engineers that I thought just ought to leave. But and others that could use some education. They promise. And anyway, so I was having some trouble. Oh no, I didn't say. I got along quite well, but there was an example of a point when they came up one Sunday. One of the engineers came up and asked me, "We've got a problem, and can you help solve it?" And I think, in a way, it was kind of addressing me as giving me a challenge. This academic kind of guy come and actually do something useful in the engineering lab. So I went down to the engineering lab, and they were listening in this little room, and they were playing a pop music track with a female vocal, and this particular voice, when it hit a certain note, the loudspeaker just howled. And they said, "There's nothing in the measurements that shows this. But what's going on here?" So I said, "What are you doing for measurements?" And well, back then they were doing some combination of third octave measurements, steady state pink noise analysis, which was really primitive. That's decades obsolete in my view. And they were just beginning to do some FFT stuff, sort of time window measurements in the listening room. And in the listening room, they'd be lucky if they could get anything useful in terms of resolution below a kilohertz, because 10 milliseconds is 100 hertz, 100 hertz resolution, and with 100 hertz resolution, you don't see any detail in the frequency response until you get up into the thousands of hertz. And so I said, well, this curve doesn't really tell me what's going on down at this particular, where the problematic frequency is. So let's find out what the problem frequency is. Get an oscillator and do a pitch match. And we did that. So it was 272 hertz or something like that. I think it was. And funny how we remember these things. And so I said, we have a little anechoic chamber. Let's take it into the anechoic chamber and measure it. Oh, okay. I measure it. And there it was. There was a little glitch in the curve at 272 hertz, which was not being shown up in their measurement. I said, so this is why we have anechoic chambers. Oh, okay. So I passed that test. The next test, I said, can you show me some off-axis measurements for this curve, this product, just out of curiosity? And they said, well, we don't normally do off-axis measurements. I said, well, would you do it for me this time? Just out of curiosity. Would you do some 30, 45, 15, 30, 45, 60, whatever. Pick some off-axis angles and do them. And I can't remember the details of it, but I was left with the impression that after lunch, I'd come back and they'd have the off-axis measurements for me. I came back after lunch and the engineering lab was empty. They had gone on strike.
Whoa.
One of the engineers, one of their senior engineers, had decided that this is just going too far. This guy Toole asking them to measure off-axis as well as on-axis. Let's go watch a movie. So they went off to a movie theater. I'm not kidding you. I made a few phone calls and they measured off-axis and continued to do so. But it was that kind of struggle sometimes to get them to do what needed to be done.
To get them in the mood or in the mindset of what it actually takes to achieve the results that they are effectively looking for. I'm sure they wanted to make good products, but they just didn't realize the way to get there.
Well, there were some traditions that had to be overcome and be expanded upon and improved. That's all. Anyway, at that time, they were doing mostly still a lot of analog stuff. Still, they had Rowan analog pen and ink kind of plots, but still. And I'd given up on that a decade before. So we had some improvements to make, and listening tests were simply out of control. But they just sat down and double-sighted listening tests. But they knew what they were listening to, and they had created the product, and so they were biased to like whatever they made, whether it was any good or not.
Feels like this product is done and ready for market. Check and on to the next one.
Yeah, and if the brand manager should be in town and wants to hear it and add his personal approval to it, he'd sit down and listen to a couple of bands of popular music and say more bass, more treble, and off he'd go. That was the way it was. So I approached Sydney Harman and corporate management again, and I said, we need to do listening tests. We have to do them properly. They are key to understanding what measurements mean. This is how I learned what measurements are useful and what ones are not useful. And if without the listening test is the final arbiter. I don't care what the measurements say. If it fails the listening test, there's a problem. And that's what the challenge of science is, to find out what the problem is. and the evidence that there's a problem is that people hear something that that's wrong. So a listening test matters. And so I convinced them that we needed to set up a little research group and perhaps continue some of the research that was started at the NRC and set up a listening test facility where we could do really controlled, efficient, double-blind listening tests on all of the products that we produce. And what harm could come from that? And amazingly, they agreed.
So there's one piece to this that I still find fascinating, and that is the idea that you came to Harman. Harman is a corporation. They want to make money.
Yeah.
But somehow you're able to convince them that it was in their best interest to essentially publish all the research that you eventually kind of led and kind of did with them.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing. I mean, Sydney Harman and his corporate partners were, I don't know what did it. I can't think that I had that kind of persuasive capability, frankly, but they went along with it. And it turns out that no harm came from it, and some good has come from it, because when you read the literature and you go online and the audio forums, Harman curved this and Harman curved that and Harman this and Harman that. It happens all the time. The name Harman is attached to measurements, to understanding, the opinions, and so on. Not everybody agrees with it, but at least you don't see other brand names being mentioned as often as Harman in the context of trying to understand what it is that makes a good loudspeaker or headphones and a good sound.
You essentially establish them as a thought leader in the industry.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and it mattered. Interestingly enough, and this is another twist that I could not have anticipated. Harman operates in consumer audio, of course, professional audio, of course, cinema sound, which is part of professional audio. So pro audio is, concerts and large facility sound systems in halls and things, the auditoria. But they also do pure sound, and they do cinema. They're a dominant factor in cinema sound in North America and significant in the world, in fact. But they also did cars. And when I joined Harman, car audio was about 10% of the business, a small part of the business. In fact, Harman's total sales within only was 500 million. And when I left, they were about 70 billion. So,
mind-boggling.
Mind-boggling indeed. It's just exponential increases. Anyway, so I was introduced at a very early stage to Harman Mobile Audio, and their techniques were fairly primitive, but they were trying hard, and I thought I could help them a little bit to improve their ability to measure what people were hearing in cars. But a car environment is just a terrible environment because the loudspeakers, the transducer, you put the transducer where you can fit it,
yeah,
not where it should go. So you have mid ranges down by your ankles and tweeters in the A pillars, and they're all over the place. So you're really designing this loudspeaker system in the car, and nobody sits in the stereo seat, so stereo is all screwed up, and you have to fiddle with the signal electronically to get anything that resembles stereo, and on it goes. So there are lots of challenges in car audio, but starting with good transducers is not a bad position to begin with, and understanding what when you do make a measurement in the car, what the ripples may or may not mean. And so I got to tag along with a couple of marketing presentations to car manufacturers. I think Ford was my very first one. And, I had a few things to say, and they listened to, observed how the engineers reacted to my comments. And it was not very long at all before I was included in these marketing presentations to car manufacturers as a feature.
Oh,
and in fact, very quickly beyond that, I was the introductory presentation. Somebody would get from marketing would get up and say, "Hello, here we are, Harman. We're going to tell you what we can bring to your product in the way of audio, and here is Dr. Toole to tell you why we believe we understand the principles of sound reproduction better than many of our competitors do." So I would give them 30 to 45 minutes of encapsulated science of audio. And it was extremely well received because automotive engineers are real hardcore engineers. This is not consumer audio at all. They design cars by measurements, by calculations, by heavy duty math and modeling. They're real. They appreciate real science, and so this helped Harman's business, frankly. So ironically, I was pitching science as a component of marketing. So yeah, Harman and science became amalgamated. It was just a remarkable synthesis of ideas and practicality. It worked.
So, and I don't want to rush ahead too much. How about this? How about we take a quick little break, and then we'll come back with a third segment and kind of finish some stuff off and kind of talk about some other things. This could go on forever, but I want to respect your time, and I want to make sure that you're comfortable, and I do still have so many questions. So let's just take a quick break, and we'll get right back to it.
Okay.
just before the break, we were talking about the research you were doing at Harman and how you were effectively allowed to and encouraged to continue doing that research. When it comes to the research that was being done at Harman, was this like a direct succession of the stuff that happened at NRC, or was this totally new directions that you were taking it? Can you talk a little bit about that, like how that all came together?
Of course, yeah, and yes, it was an evolution of what started at NRC. The NRC research had pointed out the importance of low frequency problems, and the challenge of controlling them was very, very formidable, frankly, because the Athena project was looking into how audible these problems were and what equalization itself might do to be able to alleviate some of the room resonance-based boom problems that everybody has some amount of. When I got to Harman, that problem didn't go away. When we set up our double-blind listening facility, we had the budget this time. Harman was very generous with its money, and they allowed us to spend enough money to build what we call the shuffler, the speaker shuffler. And this was a pneumatically driven set of sleds that moved loudspeakers into different positions so that whatever loudspeaker you were listening to was always in the same location. So that if there's a room problem, and there is, it would be identical for each loudspeaker. The loudspeakers are all in the same location, in the same room when they are being evaluated. And one could be exchanged for another within about 3 seconds. And so auditory memory was still pretty darn good. So we were addressing the room problem by avoiding it, if you like, in our listening tests. But the problem was still there for the real world, people in their homes and people in their recording studios and so on. Back in my custom home in Manotick, I had a bass boom problem. And it was part of my learning process of trying to understand what the physics of sound fields are in rooms at low frequencies. And in this particular room, I realized that if I had two subwoofers operating in phase, and these were located in opposite lobes of the standing wave. The standing wave has high pressure on each wall, and the lowest mode, the first order mode, has a null in the middle halfway across the room. At any instant in time, the polarity of the sound pressure on each side of the lobe is opposite. So when it's rising on one side, it's falling on the other, like a teeter-totter, pivoting on the null in the middle of the room. And so if you put two subwoofers, one in each against each wall, and they are radiating in phase, the resonance wants to go out of phase, and the woofers are forcing it to go in phase, and so it's destructive acoustic interference, and the room mode is not excited. It goes away. And I thought to myself, if that works, this is bloody clever. And so it did work. And I never forgot it. I got to Harman and I kept agitating about this. This is fine. You know, I had a particular situation in my room and I've solved it in my way. I wonder if there's a more general solution to this. It coincided with the availability of a young man called Todd Welty. And he was interviewing for a job and talking about his skills. And apart from just joining the team and participating in whatever was going on, he had a good background in acoustics and an excellent background in mathematics and acoustical modeling. And I said to him, do you suppose that if we had the opportunity to use multiple subwoofers in a room, let's start with a simple rectangle room. It's not complicated things too much. Start with a rectangular room. Are there arrangements of multiple subwoofers that would actually reduce the number of problematic resonances in that room? And so we did a MATLAB model of it and exercised this idea and came up. We went from one subwoofer to 5,000. That's one of the things that you can do mathematically very easily. And so the computer chugged away all weekend. It came back on Monday morning and told us that now once you get up to about 4, you've reached pretty much the limit of improvement. But if you have up to 4 subwoofers, things can get definitely better. And the metric that he was using, was the seat-to-seat variation. The challenge was to find some arrangement of multiple subwoofers that would make the sound field more uniform from seat to seat, so that everybody heard the same bass. If you get everybody hearing the same bass, then you apply the equalization and make it a good bass, and then everybody gets the good bass. So that was the theory. And by golly, it worked. It didn't eliminate all the modes, but it left one second order mode length and width. But that's just one filter. You can get rid of that.
Yeah.
So you're simplifying the sound field enormously. And over a large part of the room, you can just walk around and there are no bass booms. But I said to that was fine. That got published and it caused a little ripple in the world of audio. It still does. It's still there. People nowadays talk almost automatically about having multiple subwoofers. Rather than have one monster subwoofer, which is no better in terms of sound quality than having one small subwoofer, let's have 4 small subwoofers or 2 small subwoofers, and that'll be better than one big one. The other thing about having multiple subwoofers is that at those long wavelengths, they add in sound pressure. They operate in the same voltage summations. And so you get huge efficiency gains. And so then instead of having 4 large subwoofers, you end up being able to generate the same sound pressure levels with 4 small subwoofers. So yes, you have more subwoofers, but they can be smaller. So that's a tricky advantage that many people don't realize. And anyway, it's all written up in the book, and we feel come to shortly.
So, and maybe this is actually a good segue. So you're doing this extension of research and you're kind of making a lot of progress at Harman. What makes you decide that, I think it's 2007, 2008 timeframe, there's 2 big things that happen. One, you, and I'm going to do air quotes, retire, because I feel like you're still doing a lot of the same stuff, maybe not to the same degree, but you still get around and you still do a lot of work. So you retire, but then at the same time, you also are right around the corner from publishing your first book.
Yeah, the motivation to publish the book was, well, partly myself. I felt I wanted to get everything on the record, but my friend John Ergel was a factor as well, and we would get together for lunches every once in a while, and he'd been agitating with me to write a book. And when I decided to do so, he agreed to write the foreword and also to be my proofreader. And true story, I had written the first 2 chapters, and he was coming to visit on a Saturday and have dinner with my wife and I and get 2 chapters to review. He died on the Wednesday, so.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was sad. I actually sat down and cried because John was a wonderful, wonderful man, a good friend. So, yeah, I lost my proofreader, my forward writer, and a good friend, and all of that. The world lost a significant man in the field of audio and music recording. Anyway, so that's where he was a motivating factor, and the book. I was still working at Harman, doing a little bit of the background research. My Harman management colleagues thought this would be a great idea because it would be summarizing a lot of the stuff that was done at Harman, and so Harman would benefit from it. And so I had the I started it before I left Harman, and then once I retired, I worked full-time at it and finished it. And the first edition was pretty nerdy, actually. It had a lot of science in it, and I guess that exemplified my frame of mind at the time. I wanted to get that out of my system, say I'm a smart guy, and I've read all the literature. And you know, it's a good book. But second edition was a fate, really, because what happened was the Focal Press was purchased by Taylor and Francis, and Taylor and Francis decided to reprint the book with their names on the front covers and on the covers, and in doing so, somebody decided to call it a second edition, but that's not true. It's the same book. So the second edition is a fake. Third edition was real, and I basically rewrote it because I felt that I had been giving lectures at CEDIA all along here. I gave 3-hour lectures at CEDIA events. 9 hours people would pay and come and listen to me. So I was learning, on one hand, what people needed to know, because I would have discussions with the class, and I was getting better at it. I was getting better at teaching, and so the third edition is more literate, more communicate. I'm better at communicating, I think.
It still has the nerdy elements, though.
It has some nerdy elements, yes. But it also has a companion website, which was partly attended to, but not very thoroughly, because it was an afterthought. The fourth edition will have a companion website, but it will be integrating with the content. So it allows me to get nerdy and conversational in a different way, actually. It allows me to add pages to the book. The publisher set a limit of 500 roughly pages. And so every time I write these books, I find myself having to decide what to eliminate. And having a companion website means I probably don't have to eliminate very much at all. I just go on expanding endlessly. So, and the fourth edition is just going to be an expansion of that tendency, more communication, a fully integrated companion website. It'd be more autobiographical, because I feel it's a story worth telling the way it actually happened. What I'm doing here, really, it explains the science and how it happened and why it happened. And this time I'm calling in some co-authors. Sean Holland is going to be addressing headphones, which is his area of expertise. It's a topic that he took up after I retired. It's a very important topic these days, because portable audio is probably the dominant method of delivering music.
So with this new edition coming out, with the fourth edition coming out, does this bring up maybe a path forward, or things that you still think might be worth exploring for either somebody else to explore, or that you might still tinker with in your spare time?
I think my tinkering days are pretty much over, but there will be clues as to areas that still need to be clarified and expanded upon. Yeah, for sure.
And I know we're coming to an end with the time that we have with you, simply because we've just been putting you through the paces, and your poor voice has to try and do this. Before I ask kind of the standard question that I ask everyone that comes on this podcast, I want to ask something specific to you, which is, what do you want or feel like your legacy should be?
Well, I suppose I take some considerable satisfaction in realizing that manufacturers have been applying the knowledge that I have helped contribute to the field to build better loudspeakers. And so the center of gravity of sound quality has gone up, and I've contributed to it.
I would say so. And I'm just going to bring it back to something that we mentioned the first time that we started talking, which was your name continues to come up in almost every podcast episode, almost every guest we have. A lot of folks just kind of reference either your work or working with you directly as a piece of that. So I would definitely say that if that's the legacy, if that's the piece, far and exceeded that as raising the bar for what good sound is.
Well, thank you. No, it boggles my mind sometimes when I really think about it, but no, it's a source of great satisfaction. Yes, my ego is gratified. My head is swollen.
There we go. With that, the last question before I give you the rest of your afternoon back. If you were to listen to a song or an album or a collection of song for the pure enjoyment of things, not for a test or not for work or anything like that, what would that song be?
Huh, interesting.
Tracy Chapman, Fast Car, but only the first 30 seconds.
Oh God, no! That's a test. That's a test signal. It's not a bad song, and Tracy Chapman is very skilled, very talented singer. No, I've heard. Yeah, I like her actually. This is going to be off the wall, and it really is just one of those things in my life that Keith Jarrett,
okay,
and the Cologne concert. And I don't play it frequently because I don't really want to learn it.
Okay.
It is stream of consciousness music created by an absolutely brilliant mind in improvisation. And I love the fact that it is improvised and that every time I listen to it, there's something new for me. I don't find that in Mozart anymore.
That's amazing.
There it is. That I would probably, Tracy Chapman and he's fine.
I make the joke because we were talking to a number of different people, Sean Olive being the latest one, and we were talking about how that was the test track that was used most frequently at the NRC. Yeah. And he only knows the first 30 seconds of that. He's like, I don't even know what the second verse is.
Yeah. Well, when you hear Tracy Chapman, when I hear Tracy Chapman through a good loudspeaker, there should be just a little bit too much bass, and a little bit too much, a little bright, a little aggressive. But that's just the way it is. Learned it. That's normalization. I've normalized to the program material.
With that, I want to thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time. This is going to be a longer episode for everyone listening. I appreciate it. I think there is a huge amount of amazing information that's come out of this. And for those that want to learn even more, you have your 3rd edition book readily available and the 4th edition coming out soon. Is there anywhere else that people should go to keep up with what you're doing or to kind of learn more?
Well, I participate in audio forums occasionally, but I don't know that I have any more publications in me other than this next edition of the book and any further contributions to the companion website. I suspect I will probably continue to add to the companion website.
There we go. Thank you so much, Dr. Floyd Toole. All the best.
Thank you very much, and the same to you, Jorden. Bye-bye.